Hello and welcome to this tutorial on JSInterop. One of the things you're probably going to come across during your development of a Blazor application is how do you communicate back and forth between your Blazor app and JavaScript. And essentially this is what this tutorial is going to walk you through. So as you can see on the screen here, I have Visual Studio Code open. I'm just going to navigate over to a directory where I want to create the demo project. So I'm just going to do cd to documents, tutorials, JSInterop. And I'm just going to create another folder here that I'm going to put my project files within. So I'm just going to call it JSInterop demo. And I'm going to cd into that directory. The next thing I want to do here is just make sure we're going to create a Blazor server app. So all I did was just enter the command, the .NET command new, just to give me the list of templates that are available. And I'm going to create a Blazor server app. So I'm going to use the short name here. So I'm going to do .NET new Blazor server. And I'm not going to specify a name. And if I don't specify a name, it's just going to use the name of the folder that is within. It is within. So I'm just going to press enter after that. Okay, so now that that one is finished, I'm just going to clear the screen here real quick, and I'm going to run the project just so it builds up and run, make sure everything is working properly. Okay, so now that this is running, I'm just going to click on the link here to open the website and just navigate through the pages to make sure everything is working. The counter is all good, so that's perfect. Or navigating back to the terminal, I'm just going to press Control C, and that's just going to terminate the project run there. Okay, one more thing I want to do here. Since I'm running code, I'm just going to do reload the editor and then just to load up the files. Okay, yep. So that should give us this. I'm going to expand the pages folder. I'm going to open up the counter. And what is this? Okay, let's. Oh, what? This is persistent. Okay, so that's gone. So we're gonna work with the counter. As you saw when we were on the website, when we hit the counter button, which is here, this particular button was calling a method within our code behind for that Razor page, and essentially it's just calling this increment counter, and it's incrementing this private variable and setting the variable. So we're gonna refactor this particular code. It's still going to behave the same. We're going to add a little bit of some additional logic, but that's the same thing. But we're just going to refactor it so that way we abstract some of this functionality over to the JavaScript side, and then we'll see how we can call the JavaScript function and have that function from within JavaScript call our C# method code. Okay, so the first thing we want to do here is under www root, I'm just going to create a new folder called scripts, and in this folder I'm going to add a new file called interop -example. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it up just for whatever. And then in this particular file or JavaScript file, I'm going to create two functions. The first function is going to be called increment function, or sorry, increment counter. And then it's going to accept two parameters, and we'll talk about the other parameter, well, one of the parameters in just a bit here. The first one is going to be the counter value, the current counter value, and then another one is going to be an object ref. Let's see, what can we call it here so it makes sense? I guess object ref would be makes sense a little bit here in this case. And we'll talk about these two parameters in just a second, but for now just bear with me. So the first thing we want to do here is when this particular function is called, we're going to put an if-else statement here, and we're going to go counter value. So if we receive a counter value that is greater than or equal to 10, what we're going to do here is we're going to reset it. We're going to reset the counter back to 0. And this is just something additional. It doesn't exist in the current functionality of what we saw in the code in the Razor file, but we're just going to add some additional just to show you that we can pretty much control, add all the logic we want in the JavaScript. So we're just going to put a comment here, temporary, and we'll remove it. Reset counter value to 0 when value is equal to 10, when the value is greater than or equal to 10. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do here is we're also, if it's not greater than or equal to 10, then we're just going to increment the value. So increment counter value. And then we're going to create another function called set counter value. And just give me a second. So what's going to happen here is when we add the code in our Blazor file, what's going to happen is it's going to call this function initially, and this function is going to set the value of the counter. So it's going to essentially increment the counter or do whatever additional logic that we have. This function is going to call this function, and this is actually the function that's going to call our C# code. So this function is going to be called from our C# code. This function is going to call our C# code. Okay, so this one is going to take two values as well. One is called counter value, and the other one is going to be the object ref. And what we're going to do here is say object ref dot invoke method async, and what the method is going to be called, and then what value we want to pass to that particular. So what parameters we're trying to pass to that method. So we're just going to pass the counter value. So we're going to call that particular method set counter. So we're just going to name it the same as what we called the JavaScript counterpart. So we're just going to use normal naming and method naming convention in C#. We're just going to capitalize the S. So set counter value. And that's going to be the name of the method that we're going to create. We haven't created that, but we'll create it shortly. Now we're moving back up here. What we're going to do is if the counter value is greater than or equal to 10, then what we want to do is say set counter value to, so we're going to reset this value to 0, and we're going to pass the object ref to that method, to the function down here. Now if that works, if the counter value is not greater than or equal to 10, then what we want to do is set the counter value to counter value plus 1, and then we're just going to say object ref. Okay, so now that we have this JavaScript done on this, like the code within the JavaScript is done, one additional thing we want to do before we forget is we're going to navigate over to the layout.html, and in our let's see here, so we have the body. Okay, so we're going to add this file so we can be able to reference it or find it when we call it. We're going to add a script element, and the source for the script element is what we just created, which is going to be in the scripts folder, and it's going to be called interop example.js. Just want to make sure I typed it correctly. Alright, so that's good. Now we're going to navigate. We don't need, so all we did here is when our application runs, we need to be able to add this file that we created in the scripts folder, so that way we can call the functions within it. So that's essentially what I'm doing here. I just added the script element. Alright, so finally, what we want to do here is navigate over to our counter.razor file. And in the counter.razor file, what we want to do is refactor. First, let's do this. Let's add a private variable called, remember we were talking about the reference, or the object ref. So we're going to create an object reference here, a .NET object reference. And we're going to tell it that this object reference is going to be for the counter, and it could be nullable. So we're just going to say object ref. And essentially what this is this is going to be passed over to the JavaScript, so the JavaScript will know what method to be able to call back, or be able to actually call back our C# code. And you'll see I will do that very shortly here. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to use one of the lifecycle methods that are available within Blazor, which is called onInitialized. So we're going to override that. So we can set the .NET object reference on initialized. And in here, we're just going to set object ref is equal to .NET object reference dot create, which looks like a factory. And we're going to say this. So it's just going to reference this particular class. The next thing we want to do then is refactor this method to be async task. Oops, extra character there. And what we want to do here is then await. Actually, before we do that, let's get rid of this. And what we need to do to be able to use to communicate with JavaScript, we need to inject the IJS runtime. So that's exactly what I'm doing. On the top here, I'm just adding a directive that's going to be called IJS runtime, and I'm just going to call it JS runtime. And then in our method here, we're just going to say await JS runtime dot invoke void async, because we're not expecting anything from our method or from the JavaScript. If you were expecting something, then you would just go in void void JS runtime that invoke and then invoke async, and then you pass whatever value is supposed to be coming back. But here we're not expecting anything, so we're just going to go invoke void async, and we're going to first identify what JavaScript function we're trying to call, what parameters we want to pass, and we know if we go back to our interrupt example, the method or the function name is called increment counter, so we're just going to copy this function name and put it here as identifier. And then we're expecting two parameters. One is the counter value and one is an object ref. So for the counter value, we're just going to pass, first thing I want to do here is, since this is a private method, I'm just going to append an underscore. I'm going to rename this one here, and yep, and then we're just going to pass that counter value, and then we're also going to pass the object ref, because expecting two parameters. One is the current count, and also the object reference that allows the JavaScript code later on when it updates this particular count to call back the method within our C# class. Okay, so if we go back here, remember in this particular function we said that we're going to be calling a method called setCounterValue. Well, we haven't created that method, so let's do that right now. So the first thing we want to do here is go public void excuse me, setCounterValue, and in here what we're going to do is we're expecting an int to be coming back for the current counter value, and I'm just going to go counter value. So we created a parameter, and then essentially what we're going to do is set the current count, which is a private variable within this class, to the counter value that we're going to be receiving from the JavaScript code. That's essentially it. Okay, so make sure that the name is here. The final thing we want to do here is tag this particular method as being JavaScript invocable. Otherwise, you won't be able to invoke. So if it wasn't tagged with, just let me finish this. If it wasn't tagged with JS invocable, then you won't be able to call it. So you need to tag it with that. Okay, so now just to recap what we've done. We've added the JavaScript file here, added two functions. One is the increment counter, one is set counter value. If the counter value that we're receiving, when this code behind in our Razor file calls the JavaScript is greater than or equal to 10, then we're just going to set it back to 0. And we're doing that by calling this function. And if it's not, then we just increment again by calling this function. Okay, so now that we have this there, the next thing we want to do is just do a .NET run. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, well, it's going to tell us. So it's going to build and then try to run the project. If there's nothing wrong, then it should just run. Okay, so I'm going to press Control and click on the localhost HTTPS 1. It's going to open up the page again. And if you navigate over to the counter and click on the click me, As you see, it's incrementing. Now, once we reach 10, remember we put some logic in there that said, okay, once you hit that 10, I want you to reset it back to 0. So we're going to get up to 10 and hit that, and it's back to 0. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's how we can, I'm just going to navigate back over here, clear the screen. So that's essentially what we've done. We refactored the counter.razor page and the code behind to add a .NET object reference so we can pass over to JavaScript. And then JavaScript can use this particular object reference to call the method within this particular page or component that we have. And then we tagged the component that could be called from JavaScript. We tagged that method that could be called from JavaScript with a JSON invocable. And then every time this method is called, all it did was just set the current count value. And that's how you communicate back and forth between C# and JavaScript. I hope you found this this tutorial useful, and thank you again for watching. Have a good day.